Bullies threw the disabled girl's wheelchair down the stairs. Her service dog attacked. The first blow came without warning. River Castellanos felt her wheelchair jerk sideways as Marcus Wellington's steel-toed boot connected with the left wheel, sending her careening toward the concrete wall of the gymnasium. The metallic clang echoed through the corridor as her shoulder blade struck first, followed by the sickening crunch of her ribs compressing against the armrest. "Oops," Marcus drawled, his voice carrying that particular brand of manufactured innocence that had gotten him out of trouble since elementary school. "Sorry about that, Wheels." Diesel, River's German Shepherd service dog, immediately positioned himself between River and Marcus, his hackles rising as a low growl rumbled from his chest. The dog's training warred with his protective instincts, amber eyes locked on the threat, while his body remained perfectly still, waiting for a command that River couldn't give through the sharp pain radiating across her torso. "Better call off your mutt," Chloe Brennan giggled, holding up her phone to capture the scene. The camera's red recording light blinked steadily as she adjusted the angle. "This is already trending on my story." River's fingers found Diesel's harness, feeling the familiar weight of the handle that had become an extension of her own body over the past 3 years. The dog's muscles trembled with restraint, every fiber of his being programmed to protect, yet bound by the rigid discipline of his service animal training. She could smell the industrial disinfectant from the janitor's cart nearby, mixing with the lingering scent of teenage sweat and cheap cologne that seemed to permeate every inch of Westfield Preparatory Academy. "Say something," Marcus taunted, stepping closer until his shadow fell across River's face. His Ralph Lauren polo stretched tight across his chest, the horse logo catching the fluorescent light. "Come on! Tell everyone how much it hurts." The circle of phones appeared as if summoned. 17-year-old faces peered down at her through camera lenses, their expressions ranging from cruel amusement to uncomfortable silence. River recognized most of them. Kids she'd sat next to in advanced placement chemistry, partners in group projects, faces that had once nodded politely in hallways. Now they were documentarians of her humiliation, their thumb swipes and screen taps creating a permanent record of her pain. River's voice, when it finally came, carried none of the tremor that racked her hands. "Is this really what gets you off, Marcus?" The question hung in the air like smoke, cutting through the nervous laughter and shuffling feet. For a moment, the recording phones wavered, as if their owners suddenly questioned what they were capturing. Marcus's confident smirk flickered, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "What did you just say to me?" River adjusted her grip on her wheelchair rims, the rubber coating worn smooth from 3 years of constant use. Her legs, paralyzed from the waist down since the riding accident that had redefined her life, remained motionless beneath her favorite jeans, the ones her grandmother had altered to fit perfectly around her seated frame. But her upper body, strengthened by countless hours of physical therapy and adaptive sports, straightened with a poise that made several onlookers step back unconsciously. "I said," River repeated, her dark eyes never leaving Marcus's face, "is this really what gets you off?" The silence stretched until Chloe's nervous giggle shattered it. "Oh my God, she's actually talking back to you." Marcus's face flushed red, the color spreading from his neck to his carefully styled hairline. His father's construction empire had built half the commercial buildings in their Connecticut town, and his mother's family had donated the wing of the hospital where River had spent 6 months learning to navigate life in a wheelchair. The Wellington name opened doors, bought silence, and made problems disappear with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. "You think you're clever?" Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "You think that because Daddy's some kind of war hero, you're untouchable?" River felt something cold settle in her stomach. Her father's service record wasn't public knowledge, at least it shouldn't have been. Staff Sergeant Carlos Castellanos had completed 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED had sent him home with a Purple Heart and a limp that he still tried to hide during his morning runs. River had inherited his dark eyes and stubborn jaw, but she'd never mentioned his military background to anyone at school. The fact that Marcus knew suggested planning, research, the kind of deliberate targeting that elevated teenage cruelty into something far more calculated. Diesel's growl deepened, his body a coiled spring of barely contained aggression. The dog's training included extensive socialization protocols, thousands of hours learning to ignore distractions, provocations, and threats. But River could feel the tension in his muscles, the way his breath had shortened to quick, sharp pants. He was reading something in Marcus's body language that humans missed, some predatory intent that triggered every protective instinct bred into his bloodline. "Easy, boy," River murmured, her fingers finding the spot behind Diesel's ear that usually calmed him. But the gesture felt hollow, inadequate against the rising tide of violence she sensed building around them. Marcus leaned down until his face was level with hers, close enough that she could smell the energy drink on his breath and see the small scar above his left eyebrow, a souvenir from a childhood fall that his parents had paid thousands to minimize. "Your daddy's not here to protect you now, and neither is anyone else." River's response came not in words, but in action. Her right hand moved to her wheelchair's brake release, while her left gripped the push rim, executing a perfect pivot turn that put Diesel between her and Marcus, while simultaneously creating distance from the circle of phones. The movement was fluid, practiced, the result of countless hours in rehabilitation, learning to make her wheelchair an extension of her will rather than a limitation. But Marcus was ready for resistance. His foot swept forward again, this time catching the footplate of her chair and sending her spinning toward the wall with enough force to rattle her teeth. River's shoulder struck the concrete a second time, and she felt something warm and wet begin to trickle down her spine. That's when Diesel's training finally broke. The attack was swift, controlled, and utterly devastating. The German shepherd launched himself forward with the precision of a guided missile, his teeth closing around Marcus's wrist with just enough pressure to puncture skin without causing permanent damage. The training kicked in even through his protective fury. Diesel had been taught to neutralize threats while minimizing harm, to protect his handler without becoming a liability. Marcus's scream echoed through the corridor, high-pitched and raw with genuine terror. His followers scattered like startled birds, phones forgotten as they backed away from the snarling dog who held their leader immobilized with surgical precision. Chloe's recording captured it all, the moment when the predator became prey, when the carefully constructed hierarchy of high school cruelty collapsed under the weight of genuine consequence. "Call him off!" Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking with panic. "Call him off right now!" River said nothing. She simply watched, her dark eyes reflecting a satisfaction that ran deeper than revenge. This was justice, pure and elemental, delivered by a creature who understood loyalty and protection in ways that humans had forgotten. Diesel maintained his hold, his grip firm but not increasing, a living demonstration of controlled power that spoke louder than any threats or warnings. The corridor filled with running footsteps as teachers and administrators responded to the commotion. But for those eternal seconds before authority arrived, River allowed herself to appreciate the poetry of the moment, the way fear looked in Marcus Wellington's eyes, the silence that had replaced Chloe's constant giggling, the phones that had finally stopped recording as their owners realized they might have captured their own complicity in the events that led to this reversal. When River finally gave Diesel the release command, the dog immediately returned to his position at her side, as if nothing had happened. but something fundamental had shifted in the ecosystem of Westfield Preparatory Academy. The untouchable had been touched, the protected had bled, and everyone who witnessed it understood that the old rules no longer applied. Principal Morrison arrived first, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum as he assessed the scene with the practiced eye of an administrator who had spent 15 years managing the children of Connecticut's elite. His gaze moved from Marcus's bleeding wrist to River's position against the wall, taking in the scattered phones and frightened faces with the calculation of a man whose job depended on making problems disappear quietly. "Everyone return to class immediately," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Miss Brennan, delete that recording. Mr. Wellington, nurse's office now." But River's voice cut through his orders like a blade. "I want a police report filed." Morrison's expression shifted, becoming something harder, more protective. "Miss Castellanos, I think we can handle this internally. After all, your dog did attack another student." The words hung in the air, loaded with implications and threats. River felt the familiar weight of institutional power pressing down on her, the same force that had made her accident reports disappear, that had turned her father's inquiries into polite deferrals, that had transformed weeks of documented harassment into isolated incidents unworthy of serious attention. But this time, she had evidence. This time, there were witnesses. And this time, Marcus Wellington's blood was drying on Diesel's teeth, creating a narrative that even the most skilled administrator couldn't completely rewrite. River's smile, when it came, was sharp enough to cut glass. "Yes," she said quietly. "He did." The weeks that followed the incident in the corridor established a pattern of systematic torment that would have impressed military strategists with its precision and scope. Marcus Wellington's injured wrist became a rallying symbol for his followers, the bandages replaced daily with theatrical precision that drew maximum sympathy from teachers and classmates alike. River's mornings began with finding her combination lock glued shut, forcing her to arrive late to first-period advanced placement literature, where Mrs. Henley would mark her tardy with disapproving clicks of her tongue. The elderly teacher, whose husband had received a substantial donation for his congressional campaign from Wellington Construction, seemed particularly invested in River's punctuality issues. "Reliability is a cornerstone of character," Mrs. Henley would announce, her eyes fixed meaningfully on River's empty desk as the final bell rang. "Some people simply don't understand the importance of respecting other people's time." By third period, River would discover that someone had loosened the bolts on her desk chair in advanced placement physics, causing her to pitch forward dramatically when she leaned over her lab notes. Mr. Garrett, the physics teacher whose country club membership had been sponsored by the Wellington family for the past 5 years, treated each incident as River's personal clumsiness rather than deliberate sabotage. "Perhaps you should consider a more stable seating arrangement," he would suggest with false concern, ignoring the snickers from Marcus's corner of the classroom. "We can't have safety issues disrupting the learning environment." The cafeteria became a gauntlet of calculated humiliation. River's usual table near the windows mysteriously acquired a permanent, reserved sign that appeared whenever she approached with her lunch tray. Diesel, whose service animal status legally guaranteed him access to all areas of the school, would guide River to alternative seating while students captured her search for a place to eat on their phones. "Service dog seeks table for 2, Chloe would narrate for her social media followers, her voice carrying the false sweetness that had made her popular since middle school. "No humans wanted for company." The hashtag Wheels and Heels began trending in their school's local social media circles, accompanied by memes that depicted River as everything from a demolition derby vehicle to a battering ram. The posts were carefully crafted to avoid obvious cruelty while maintaining plausible deniability. After all, they were just jokes, just teenagers being teenagers. River's attempts to document the harassment met with bureaucratic brilliance that would have impressed government censors. When she brought screenshots of the social media posts to Principal Morrison's office, she was told that off-campus behavior fell outside the school's jurisdiction unless it directly threatened student safety. While these posts are certainly in poor taste, Morrison explained from behind his mahogany desk, a framed photo of himself with the Wellington family prominently displayed among his credentials. We cannot police every juvenile attempt at humor. Perhaps you could block these students on your devices. When River pointed out that the posts were affecting her ability to participate fully in school activities, Morrison's expression shifted to one of practiced sympathy. Have you considered that your situation might make some students uncomfortable? Perhaps there are ways to be less disruptive to the classroom environment. The suggestion hung between them like poison gas. River felt her father's military training echo in her mind, the importance of choosing battles, of understanding terrain, of recognizing when retreat was actually a strategic redeployment. She thanked Principal Morrison for his time and left his office with a clearer understanding of the forces arrayed against her. Her father noticed the change immediately. Staff Sergeant Carlos Castellanos had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by learning to read people's stress levels in their posture, their sleep patterns, their eating habits. When River began pushing food around her plate instead of eating, when her homework sessions stretched later into the night, when Diesel started displaying signs of increased alertness around the house, Carlos knew his daughter was under siege. "Talk to me, River," he said one evening as they sat on the back porch watching Diesel patrol the perimeter of their yard. "Whatever's happening, we face it together." River wanted to tell him everything about the glued locks and loosened bolts, about the social media campaigns and cafeteria humiliations, about the way teachers looked through her as if she were invisible. But she also understood the mathematics of her situation. Her father had already fought one war. She wouldn't ask him to fight another one against an enemy that specialized in making problems disappear. "Just some typical high school drama," she said, hating the lie even as it left her lips. "Nothing I can't handle." Carlos studied her face with the intensity of a man trained to detect deception under combat conditions. But he also recognized his daughter's stubborn independence, the same trait that had driven her to excel in adaptive sports, to maintain a 4.0 GPA despite spending 6 months in rehabilitation, to refuse any accommodation that might be perceived as special treatment. "You know where to find me," he said finally, his hand briefly covering hers. "Day or night." The harassment followed River home through social media platforms that turned her private spaces into extensions of her school torment. Anonymous accounts appeared on Instagram and Snapchat, posting edited photos of her with cruel captions that exploited her disability for comedic effect. The images were altered just enough to avoid copyright violation while maximizing humiliation. River's head photoshopped onto various disabled cartoon characters, her wheelchair transformed into absurd vehicles, her serious expression paired with mocking quotations. TikTok became a particularly effective weapon. Short videos appeared showing wheelchair users falling down stairs or struggling with simple tasks, always tagged with "Greater Than Wheels Challenge" and featuring River's face in the thumbnail. The clips never showed her directly, maintaining the fiction that she wasn't being targeted while ensuring that anyone searching her name would find a repository of cruelty. The most insidious aspect of the campaign was its viral nature. Students from other schools began sharing the content, unaware of its origins or purpose. River's humiliation became entertainment for thousands of teenagers who saw her as a meme rather than a person, a punchline rather than a victim. River documented everything with the methodical precision her father had taught her. Screenshots, timestamps, usernames, IP addresses when she could track them. She built a digital evidence file that grew larger each day, but every report to platform administrators resulted in the same response. The content didn't violate community standards. Users were encouraged to block accounts they found offensive. Free speech protections limited the company's ability to remove borderline content. Have you tried reaching out to these users directly? One customer service representative suggested during a phone call. Sometimes a personal conversation can resolve these misunderstandings. River almost laughed at the absurdity. She could picture herself sending direct messages to Marcus Wellington and his followers. "Hello, could you please stop orchestrating my systematic dehumanization? Thanks so much." The psychological warfare extended into her academic life with surgical precision. Group projects became exercises in isolation as partners quietly requested transfers or simply excluded her from meetings. Study groups dissolved when she expressed interest in joining. Teachers, influenced by subtle pressure from parents who valued their positions at Westfield Preparatory, began grading her work with increasing scrutiny. "Your essay lacks the depth we've come to expect," Mrs. Henley wrote on a paper that River had spent 3 weeks researching and writing. "Perhaps you could benefit from additional tutoring resources." The same essay structure that had earned her an A plus the previous semester now warranted a C-, complete with suggestions for improvement that seemed designed to consume her entire weekend. River understood the game. Death by 1,000 cuts. Each individually defensible but collectively devastating. The breaking point approached with the inexorable momentum of an avalanche. River sensed it in the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, in the increased coordination between her tormentors, in the way Principal Morrison had begun scheduling impromptu meetings with her parents about behavioral concerns that materialized from nowhere. "We're worried about River's social adjustment," Morrison explained to her parents during one such conference, his tone heavy with manufactured concern. "Several teachers have noticed signs of withdrawal, academic decline, and what appears to be increasing aggression from her service animal." River's mother, Maria Castellanos, had immigrated from Guatemala with nothing but determination and a fierce protective instinct that had propelled her daughter through 6 months of intensive rehabilitation. She listened to Morrison's carefully crafted presentation with the patience of someone who understood institutional power but refused to be intimidated by it. "What specific behavioral incidents are you referencing?" Maria asked, her accent adding weight to each word. "Because we keep very detailed records at home, and River's behavior has been exemplary." Morrison shuffled through papers on his desk, the gesture buying time while he formulated a response that would sound official without providing specific evidence. "It's more about overall patterns, Mrs. Castellanos. Subtle changes that trained educators learn to recognize." Carlos leaned forward in his chair, his posture shifting from civilian parent to military intelligence officer. "Are you suggesting that my daughter poses a threat to other students?" Not a threat exactly," Morrison backpedaled quickly, "but we need to consider the well-being of all our students. Perhaps River would be more comfortable in a specialized environment that could better accommodate her unique needs." The suggestion hung in the air like a landmine waiting to explode. River felt her parents' tension radiating across the small conference room, their protective instincts warring with their desire to maintain the diplomatic relationships that kept their daughter in one of the state's most prestigious academic institutions. "River stays," Carlos said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "And if there are specific behavioral issues, we'll address them with specific evidence and specific solutions." Morrison nodded with the practiced diplomacy of an administrator who had learned never to push certain parents too hard. But River caught the look in his eyes, calculation, frustration, and something that resembled a threat. She understood that they had won this battle while simultaneously ensuring that the war would escalate. That night, River lay in bed listening to Diesel's breathing from his spot on the floor beside her. The dog's sleep was restless, interrupted by small whimpers and leg movements that suggested he was dreaming of protection scenarios, his subconscious mind rehearsing responses to threats that his waking hours couldn't fully prepare him for. She thought about her father's stories from Afghanistan, about how insurgents used children and civilians as shields, about how the most dangerous enemies were the ones who understood exactly how much pressure they could apply without triggering overwhelming retaliation. Marcus Wellington and his followers had mastered the art of institutional terrorism, crafting their attacks to maximize damage while minimizing official consequences. But River also remembered her father's other lessons, about patience, about gathering intelligence, about waiting for the enemy to make the crucial mistake that would expose them to decisive counterattack. Marcus's confidence was growing with each successful humiliation, his sense of invulnerability expanding like a balloon that was being filled beyond its capacity. All balloons eventually burst. River just had to be ready when it happened. The escalation began on a Tuesday morning with geometry that would have impressed ancient Greek mathematicians. Marcus Wellington stood at the top of the main staircase, his position carefully chosen to maximize both the physical and psychological impact of what he had planned. The stairs descended 15 feet across 23 steps, each one constructed from polished granite that the Wellington family's construction company had installed during the school's last renovation. River approached the top of the staircase, unaware of the choreographed nature of what was about to unfold. Her first period advanced placement history class had run late due to a discussion about the Americans with Disabilities Act, a topic that Mrs. Peterson had introduced with obvious discomfort, glancing repeatedly at River as if her presence in the classroom made the lesson personally awkward. Diesel walked beside River's wheelchair with his usual alertness, his service animal training, keeping him focused on potential obstacles and hazards. But the dog's conditioning had prepared him for architectural barriers and medical emergencies, not for the calculated malice of teenagers who had spent weeks planning the perfect crime. Marcus's friends had positioned themselves strategically throughout the hallway. Chloe Brennan waited at the bottom of the stairs with her phone ready, the angle carefully calculated to capture maximum drama while maintaining plausible deniability about her foreknowledge of events. Tyler Morrison, Principal Morrison's son, whose academic failures had been quietly overlooked in exchange for family loyalty, loitered near the trophy case, ready to provide witness testimony that would favor Marcus's version of events. The attack, when it came, was both swift and devastating. Marcus approached from River's left side, the blind spot created by her wheelchair's armrest, and spoke in a tone of false friendliness that immediately triggered Diesel's protective instincts. "Hey, Wheels," Marcus said, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that passing students would hear his next words. "My dad wanted me to thank you for all the free publicity. Turns out controversy sells construction contracts." River turned toward him, recognizing the calculated nature of the comment, but unprepared for the physical assault that followed. Marcus's hands struck her wheelchair's push handles with precisely applied force, sending her careening toward the top of the staircase with enough momentum to overcome her manual brakes. The physics of what happened next would later be analyzed by investigators with the precision of accident reconstruction specialists. River's wheelchair, propelled by Marcus's shove and pulled by gravity, began its descent down the granite stairs with increasing velocity. Each impact against a step sent shockwaves through the chair's frame and into River's spine, her body becoming a projectile in a trajectory that Marcus had calculated to ensure maximum damage without crossing the line into attempted murder. Diesel's response was immediate and violent. The German Shepherd launched himself at Marcus with 65 pounds of precisely directed fury, his training momentarily overwhelmed by the sight of his handler in mortal danger. But Marcus had prepared for this eventuality, pulling a telescoping baton from his backpack, a weapon his father had provided for personal protection that was both illegal on school grounds and perfectly designed to neutralize an attacking dog. The first blow caught Diesel across the ribs, a sickening crack that echoed through the hallway as students began screaming and pulling out their phones. The second strike targeted the dog's head, but Diesel's combat training kicked in, his body weaving away from the weapon while his teeth sought Marcus's wrist with surgical precision. River's descent continued with the unstoppable momentum of an avalanche. Her wheelchair struck each granite step with impacts that jarred her teeth and compressed her spine, the mechanical cacophony mixing with Diesel's snarls and Marcus's screams to create a symphony of violence that would haunt the hallways of Westfield Preparatory Academy for years to come. But the most devastating aspect of the attack was its documentation. Chloe's phone captured every second in high-definition clarity, the automatic stabilization software ensuring that the footage would be perfectly viewable for the millions of people who would eventually witness River's attempted murder. Other students recorded from different angles, their social media reflexes overriding any impulse to intervene or call for help. The wheelchair's final impact came at the bottom of the stairs, where the granite steps met the polished concrete of the main hallway. River's body pitched forward from the chair, her hands instinctively reaching out to break her fall, while her paralyzed legs remained trapped in the footrests. The sound of her wrists snapping on impact was audible even over the chaos surrounding Diesel's fight with Marcus. Principal Morrison arrived at the scene with suspicious speed, suggesting that he had been monitoring the situation from his office's security cameras. His first action was not to call for medical assistance or check on River's condition, but to begin shouting orders that seemed designed more to control the narrative than to provide aid. "Everyone put your phones away immediately," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose job depended on making problems disappear. "This is a medical emergency, not entertainment." But the footage was already uploading to social media platforms with the viral efficiency of the digital age. TikTok videos, Instagram stories, and Snapchat posts began flooding feeds across Connecticut and beyond, each one tagged with hashtags that would soon trend nationally. Wheelchair attack, disability violence, service dogfight spread across the internet with the unstoppable momentum of a wildfire. River lay motionless at the bottom of the stairs, her consciousness flickering between awareness and darkness as her body processed the trauma of her 15-foot fall. She could hear Diesel's continued snarling somewhere above her, the sound growing weaker as blood loss and Marcus's baton took their toll. She tried to call his name, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, lost in the chaos of screaming students and Morrison's shouted commands. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later, but not before Marcus had been treated by the school nurse for his dog bite injuries, and not before Principal Morrison had confiscated phones from the students, most likely to post footage that contradicted the official narrative he was already constructing. The paramedics who loaded River onto a stretcher were professionals, but they worked under the watchful eyes of administrators who made subtle suggestions about privacy, about the importance of discretion, about the liability issues surrounding service animal attacks. Diesel was forcibly separated from River for the first time since they had been partnered, the injured dog dragged away by animal control officers who had been summoned with suspicious efficiency. River's last clear memory before the morphine took effect was the sight of her best friend, her protector, her lifeline being caged and loaded into a van while blood matted his fur and confusion clouded his amber eyes. At Connecticut Children's Medical Center, River underwent 6 hours of surgery to repair the damage from her fall. 2 broken wrists, 3 cracked ribs, a concussion and spinal compression that threatened the limited mobility she had maintained in her upper body. Dr. Sarah Chen, the orthopedic surgeon who performed the procedures, had seen enough suspicious injuries in her 15-year career to recognize the difference between accidents and assaults. These injury patterns are consistent with a violent fall down a significant height, Dr. Chen explained to River's parents, her voice carefully neutral in the way medical professionals learned when they suspected but couldn't prove deliberate harm. The wrist fractures in particular suggest that she was conscious and trying to protect herself during the fall. Carlos Castellanos listened to the medical analysis with the focused intensity of someone who had seen combat injuries in military hospitals overseas. His daughter's wounds told a story that contradicted every official explanation he had received from school administrators, and his questions reflected the investigative skills of someone trained in battlefield intelligence gathering. Were there any signs of external force applied to River's wheelchair? He asked, his tone suggesting that he already suspected the answer. Dr. Chen hesitated, her professional ethics warring with her moral obligations. "I can only report on the injuries I observe," she said finally. "But someone should examine the wheelchair itself for evidence of tampering or external impact." The wheelchair had already disappeared from the school's evidence room by the time Carlos arrived to retrieve River's personal belongings. Principal Morrison explained that the equipment had been damaged beyond repair in the fall and had been disposed of according to standard safety protocols. No photographs had been taken, no measurements recorded, no forensic analysis performed on the device that had carried River down 15 granite steps. "These incidents are always traumatic," Morrison said with practiced sympathy. "We want to move forward in a way that promotes healing for everyone involved. But healing would prove difficult when the official narrative bore no resemblance to the truth that was spreading across social media platforms faster than administrators could contain it. The footage captured by dozens of students painted a picture that contradicted every aspect of the school's version of events, and the hashtags associated with River's assault began attracting attention from journalists, lawyers, and disability rights advocates across the country. Marcus Wellington spent 2 days in the hospital receiving treatment for his dog bite injuries, his room filled with flowers and sympathy cards from classmates who viewed him as the victim of an unprovoked animal attack. His father hired a crisis management firm that specialized in controlling narratives for wealthy families facing public relations disasters, and their first recommendation was to file a lawsuit against River's family for the medical expenses and emotional trauma caused by Diesel's vicious assault. The legal papers were served while River was still unconscious in her hospital bed, her sedated body connected to monitors that tracked her vital signs, while lawyers argued over liability and responsibility in conference rooms across the city. Wellington Construction's legal team had filed preliminary injunctions seeking to have Diesel euthanized as a dangerous animal, restraining orders preventing the Castellanos family from contacting any member of the Wellington family, and damage claims that would have bankrupted a military family surviving on staff sergeant pay. But Marcus Wellington had made a crucial error in his calculation of acceptable risk. The footage of River's assault had captured not just her fall down the stairs, but the moment when he had drawn the telescoping baton and used it against a service animal whose only crime was protecting his disabled handler. The image of a wealthy teenager beating an injured dog while his victim lay broken at the bottom of a staircase was not one that crisis management firms could easily spin into sympathy. The video went viral with the explosive force of a social media phenomenon, accumulating millions of views across multiple platforms within 48 hours of the initial posts. News outlets began picking up the story, framing it as a case study in privilege, disability rights, and institutional corruption that resonated with audiences far beyond Connecticut's borders. River regained consciousness to find her hospital room filled with flowers from strangers, cards from disability advocacy groups, and a stack of business cards from lawyers who specialized in civil rights violations. But the most important visitor was Diesel himself, who had been released from animal control after veterinary examination confirmed that his actions had been defensive rather than aggressive. The German Shepherd lay beside River's hospital bed, with bandages covering his ribs and a protective cone around his neck to prevent him from worrying the stitches above his left eye. His amber eyes never left River's face, as if he were afraid that looking away might cause her to disappear again. "Hey, boy," River whispered, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed that morning. "We really messed them up, didn't we?" Diesel's tail thumped once against the floor, a gesture of agreement that carried more weight than all the legal documents and crisis management strategies being deployed across the city. River and her dog had survived the assault designed to break them, and their survival had exposed the systematic cruelty that had been hidden behind institutional respectability for too long. The reckoning was just beginning. Marcus Wellington's carefully constructed world began collapsing with the precision of a controlled demolition, each new revelation weakening the foundation of privilege and protection that had insulated him from consequences throughout his 17 years of life. The viral footage of River's assault had created a digital paper trail that even the most skilled crisis management professionals couldn't erase, and the hashtags associated with her attack continued spreading across social media platforms with the unstoppable momentum of a natural disaster. Justice for River became a rallying cry that attracted attention from disability rights organizations across the country. The National Paralysis Resource Center issued a statement condemning the attack and calling for federal investigation into civil rights violations. The American Civil Liberties Union offered legal representation to the Castellanos family. Celebrity advocates, including actors, athletes, and politicians, began sharing the footage with their millions of followers, transforming a local bullying incident into a national conversation about institutional bias and systemic abuse. River's hospital room became an unlikely command center for a movement that neither she nor her family had anticipated. Messages of support arrived from across the globe, many written in languages that required translation, but all conveying the same basic message. What happened to River could not be tolerated, and the people responsible would face consequences commensurate with their crimes. Dr. Elena Vasquez from the University of Connecticut's Disability Studies program visited River during her second week of recovery, bringing with her a perspective that helped contextualize the attack within broader patterns of ableist violence that rarely received mainstream attention. "What happened to you is horrific," Dr. Vasquez explained, her own wheelchair positioned beside River's bed as they spoke. "But it's also representative of systemic attitudes that treat disabled people as acceptable targets for violence and humiliation." River listened with growing understanding as Dr. Vasquez outlined statistics that painted a disturbing picture of disability-based harassment in educational settings. Students with disabilities were 3 times more likely to experience bullying than their non-disabled peers. Schools consistently underreported incidents of disability-based harassment. Administrative responses typically focused on containing controversy rather than addressing root causes. "Your case is unique because it was so well documented," Dr. Vasquez continued. "Most victims don't have video evidence of their assault, and most perpetrators don't make the mistake of attacking a service animal in front of dozens of witnesses." The digital evidence that Marcus had tried to control had instead become his downfall. Frame-by-frame analysis of the footage revealed premeditation that elevated his actions from simple assault to attempted murder. The positioning of his accomplices, the timing of their movements, the precision of his shove, all suggested planning that transformed teenage cruelty into criminal conspiracy. Forensic investigators hired by the Castellanos family's legal team discovered additional evidence that had been overlooked in the initial chaos. Security cameras throughout the school had captured Marcus and his friends, conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance missions, timing River's daily routes, and identifying optimal locations for maximum impact. Text messages recovered from confiscated phones revealed weeks of planning, including discussions about how to ensure that any resulting injuries would appear accidental. The most damaging evidence came from Marcus's own social media accounts, where he had posted increasingly violent fantasies about disabled students in the weeks leading up to the assault. The posts, which had been temporarily deleted but recovered through digital forensics, included detailed descriptions of how wheelchair users could be taught lessons about their place in social hierarchies. "She thinks she's special because of her stupid dog," one recovered message read. "Time to show her what special really looks like." Another post, shared just 3 days before the attack, included a photoshopped image of River falling downstairs with the caption, "Gravity doesn't discriminate." The Wellington family's legal strategy shifted rapidly as the evidence mounted against their son. The initial narrative of self-defense against a vicious animal attack gave way to claims of mental health issues, teenage impulsivity, and social media influence that had corrupted an otherwise good kid. Crisis management professionals recommended a rehabilitation-focused approach that emphasized Marcus's potential for growth and learning, rather than the permanent consequences sought by prosecutors. But the viral nature of the assault footage had created a public appetite for justice that even skilled public relations professionals couldn't satisfy with sympathy narratives. The image of Marcus beating an injured service dog while his victim lay broken at the bottom of a staircase had crystallized into a symbol of privilege and cruelty that resonated far beyond the disability rights community. River's father took leave from his job to coordinate with the growing team of investigators, lawyers, and advocates who had volunteered their services to ensure that justice was served. Staff Sergeant Carlos Castellanos brought military precision to the task of documenting every aspect of the systematic harassment that had preceded the assault, creating a timeline that revealed the calculated nature of Marcus's campaign of terror. "This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment," Carlos explained to the prosecutor assigned to the case. "This was a sustained psychological warfare operation designed to break my daughter's spirit before escalating to physical violence." The prosecutor, Jennifer Walsh, had spent 8 years handling violent crimes in Connecticut's juvenile justice system. She had seen wealthy teenagers escape consequences for everything from drunk driving to sexual assault, their families' resources and connections typically ensuring probation and community service rather than incarceration. But the public attention surrounding River's case had created political pressure that made the usual accommodations politically impossible. "We're looking at charges including aggravated assault, conspiracy to commit assault, animal cruelty, and civil rights violations," Walsh explained to the Castellanos family during their first meeting. "The federal civil rights charges carry potential prison sentences that juvenile court can't accommodate." The prospect of Marcus Wellington being tried as an adult sent shockwaves through Connecticut's social elite. Wellington Construction had built relationships with politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials throughout the state. And those relationships were now being tested by a case that had attracted too much attention to be quietly resolved. Phone calls were made to editorial boards, suggesting that excessive prosecution of a teenage boy would set dangerous precedents for juvenile justice. Donations were offered to scholarship funds and charity organizations, accompanied by subtle suggestions that prosecutorial discretion might serve the community's interests better than lengthy trials. Legal challenges were filed, questioning the validity of evidence, the competence of investigators, and the motivations of prosecutors who seemed more interested in political grandstanding than justice. But the machinery of accountability had acquired momentum that proved resistant to traditional forms of influence. Social media campaigns organized by disability rights advocates generated thousands of emails to prosecutors' offices, demanding that Marcus face adult charges commensurate with his crimes. News coverage continued focusing on the systematic nature of the harassment and the institutional failures that had enabled escalation to violence. River's recovery became a public story that humanized disability in ways that resonated with audiences who had never considered the daily challenges faced by wheelchair users. Footage of her rehabilitation sessions, shared with her permission by the hospital's physical therapy department, showed her relearning basic tasks that most people took for granted. Putting on shirts with broken wrists, transferring between beds and wheelchairs with compressed vertebrae, training with a new service dog to replace Diesel while he recovered from his injuries. The replacement dog, a golden retriever named Phoenix, who had been donated by a service animal organization in California, became an unexpected symbol of resilience and renewal. Videos of River and Phoenix learning to work together attracted millions of views, many accompanied by donations to disability advocacy organizations and scholarship funds for adaptive sports programs. Marcus Wellington's social media presence, meanwhile, became increasingly desperate as his traditional support systems crumbled under public scrutiny. Friends who had enthusiastically participated in River's harassment began distancing themselves as lawyers advised their families about potential liability exposure. Chloe Brennan deactivated all her accounts after receiving thousands of messages condemning her role in documenting and distributing footage of the assault. The school's response evolved from denial to damage control to complete capitulation as evidence mounted and public pressure intensified. Principal Morrison was placed on administrative leave, pending investigation into his handling of River's harassment reports. Mrs. Henley and Mr. Garrett, the teachers whose obvious bias had enabled Marcus's campaign of terror, found their employment contracts under review by a school board suddenly concerned about liability and reputation. Westfield Preparatory Academy hired an independent investigation firm to examine its policies and procedures for handling disability-related harassment. The preliminary findings, leaked to local media outlets, revealed systematic failures that had created an environment where students like Marcus felt empowered to escalate from verbal harassment to physical violence without fear of meaningful consequences. The investigation discovered that River's reports of harassment had been deliberately minimized in official records, with incidents that should have triggered federal civil rights investigations instead treated as personality conflicts between students. Security footage that should have been preserved as evidence had been routinely deleted according to policies that seemed designed more to protect the institution than its students. Most damaging was the revelation that Marcus's history of violence toward disabled students extended back to elementary school, with a pattern of behavior that had been consistently covered up by administrators eager to maintain relationships with the Wellington family's financial contributions. Previous victims and their families began coming forward with stories of harassment, assault, and institutional indifference that painted a picture of systematic abuse enabled by wealth and privilege. River watched the mounting revelations from her hospital bed with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The justice she had sought for months was finally materializing, but the process of achieving it had consumed her family's resources and emotional energy in ways that felt almost as damaging as the original assault. "You did this," her mother said one evening as they watched news coverage of the latest developments in Marcus's case. "You stood up when everyone else looked away." River's response came slowly, each word carefully chosen to reflect the complexity of her feelings about becoming an unwilling symbol of disability rights and institutional accountability. "I just wanted him to stop," she said finally. "I never wanted to become famous for being attacked." But fame had found her regardless of her preferences, and with it came responsibilities that extended far beyond her personal quest for justice. Letters arrived daily from disabled students across the country who saw River's courage as inspiration for their own struggles against harassment and institutional indifference. Advocacy organizations invited her to speak at conferences and rallies, where her story could amplify broader messages about civil rights and systemic change. The movement that had formed around River's assault was beginning to achieve victories that extended far beyond Marcus Wellington's prosecution. School districts across Connecticut implemented new policies for handling disability-related harassment complaints. Federal agencies opened investigations into civil rights violations that had been ignored for years. Legislation was introduced requiring mandatory reporting of disability-based violence in educational settings. River understood that her assault had become a catalyst for changes that would protect countless other students from experiencing what she had endured. But she also knew that those changes came at a price that included her privacy, her anonymity, and her ability to simply be a 17-year-old girl dealing with the ordinary challenges of high school rather than the extraordinary burden of leading a civil rights movement. The paradox of visibility, that justice required publicity that transformed victims into symbols, would define River's life for years to come. But as she watched Marcus Wellington's world collapse under the weight of consequences he had never imagined possible, she felt a satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. The system that had protected him was finally holding him accountable. And River had proven that even the most privileged predators could be brought to justice when their victims refused to be silenced. The Westfield Preparatory Academy Board of Trustees convened their emergency session on a Thursday evening in November, their usual conference room inadequate for the crowds of parents, students, media representatives, and disability rights advocates who had arrived to witness what local news outlets were calling the most contentious school board meeting in Connecticut's recent history. The venue had been moved to the school's auditorium, its 500 seats filled beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering in hallways and streaming the proceedings live on social media platforms. River arrived with her parents and Phoenix, her new service dog, his golden coat gleaming under the auditorium's stage lights as they made their way to the reserved seating section near the front. The cast on her left wrist had been replaced with a removable brace that allowed her to operate her replacement wheelchair, though the chronic pain from her spinal compression would require management for years to come. The media presence was overwhelming. Camera crews from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and local stations positioned themselves strategically throughout the auditorium, their equipment creating a technological forest that transformed the space into something resembling a television studio. Social media influencers live-streamed commentary to audiences numbering in the tens of thousands, their real-time analysis shaping public perception as events unfolded. Board Chairman Harrison Wells, whose family's pharmaceutical fortune had endowed the school's science wing, called the meeting to order with obvious reluctance. The agenda included official responses to the independent investigation's findings, policy changes designed to prevent future incidents, and personnel decisions that would determine whether Principal Morrison and the teachers who had enabled Marcus's harassment campaign would retain their positions. But the evening's most anticipated moment was River's scheduled testimony, her first public statement since the assault that had transformed her from anonymous student into national symbol. She had spent weeks preparing her remarks with the help of disability rights attorneys who understood the political and legal implications of every word she would speak. Marcus Wellington was notably absent from the proceedings, his legal team having advised against any public appearances while criminal charges remained pending. His parents sat in the back row, their expressions carefully neutral as they endured the scrutiny of hundreds of people who held them responsible for their son's crimes. Wellington Construction had been the target of boycotts that cost the company millions in cancelled contracts, and the family's social standing in Connecticut's elite circles had evaporated with the efficiency of morning frost. The board's presentation began with a summary of the independent investigation's findings delivered by Dr. Patricia Hughes, the former federal prosecutor who had led the inquiry. Her report painted a picture of institutional failure that extended far beyond individual bad actors, revealing systematic policies and cultural attitudes that had created an environment where disability-based harassment could flourish unchecked. Our investigation identified 47 documented incidents of disability-related harassment at Westfield Preparatory Academy over the past 5 years, Dr. Hughes announced, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. Of those incidents, only 3 resulted in disciplinary actions more serious than verbal warnings. The statistic prompted audible gasps from parents who had assumed their children attended an institution committed to protecting all students equally. Board members shifted uncomfortably as Dr. Hughes continued outlining failures that implicated every level of the school's administration in a culture of indifference toward disabled students' welfare. The investigation had uncovered internal communications that revealed disturbing attitudes among faculty and staff. Email exchanges between teachers included jokes about disabled students, complaints about accommodations required by federal law, and explicit discussions about limiting disabled enrollment to avoid complications that might affect the school's reputation for academic excellence. Most damaging was evidence that Principal Morrison had maintained informal policies designed to discourage disabled students from filing harassment complaints. The investigation found that families reporting disability-based harassment were typically informed about the challenges of proving discrimination, the reputational risks of pursuing formal complaints, and the benefits of resolving conflicts through mediation rather than official disciplinary processes. These policies created a two-tiered justice system, Dr. Hughes explained, where wealthy families like the Wellingtons received immediate attention and protection, while disabled students were systematically discouraged from seeking help through official channels. River listened to the litany of institutional failures with growing anger, understanding for the first time the full scope of the system that had been designed to protect her attackers while silencing their victims. Her own experience had been part of a broader pattern that affected dozens of students whose stories had never received public attention. When her time came to address the board, River approached the podium with Phoenix at her side, her prepared remarks forgotten as she looked out over an auditorium filled with people whose presence represented the transformation of her personal trauma into a platform for systemic change. "My name is River Castellanos," she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "6 weeks ago, Marcus Wellington threw me down a flight of stairs while his friends recorded it for entertainment, but that wasn't the beginning of my story with this school." River's testimony unfolded with the methodical precision her father had taught her, each incident of harassment placed within the broader context of institutional indifference that had enabled escalation to violence. She described her failed attempts to report the harassment, the teachers who had looked through her as if she were invisible, the administrators who had treated her assault as a public relations problem rather than a criminal act. "I didn't ask to become a symbol," River continued, her eyes moving across the faces in the audience. "I just wanted to attend school without being afraid. But this board, these administrators, these teachers, created an environment where students like Marcus felt empowered to escalate harassment into attempted murder." The auditorium remained absolutely silent as River detailed the psychological impact of systematic dehumanization, the way months of unchecked harassment had eroded her sense of safety and belonging in educational spaces that were supposed to protect all students equally. "Phoenix isn't just my service dog," River said, her hand resting on the golden retriever's head. "He's a replacement for Diesel, who was beaten with a weapon while trying to protect me from your student's attack. Phoenix is here because this institution failed to protect either of us from violence that was predictable, preventable, and enabled by policies that prioritized protecting perpetrators over their victims." River's voice strengthened as she reached the conclusion of her testimony, her words carrying the weight of months of pain and the authority of someone who had survived an attempt to destroy her spirit. "You can fire Principal Morrison, you can change policies, you can issue statements about your commitment to inclusion and safety. But until you acknowledge that what happened to me was the inevitable result of treating disabled students as second-class citizens, you're just rearranging deck chairs on a sinking ship." The standing ovation that followed River's testimony lasted nearly 5 minutes, the sustained applause echoing through the auditorium as camera crews captured the moment for audiences watching around the world. Board members sat frozen in their chairs, their political calculations visible in expressions that ranged from defensive anger to reluctant admiration. But the evening's most dramatic moment came during the public comment period that followed River's testimony. Chloe Brennan approached the podium with obvious reluctance, her designer clothes and careful makeup unable to disguise the psychological toll of becoming a social media pariah whose role in documenting River's assault had made her a target for public condemnation. "I want to apologize," Chloe began, her voice barely audible over the murmurs of surprise that rippled through the audience. "I recorded River's attack. I shared it online. I participated in months of harassment that I knew was wrong, but did anyway because I was afraid of becoming a target myself." Chloe's confession continued with the halting cadence of someone unaccustomed to accepting responsibility for her actions. She described the group psychology that had made participating in River's harassment feel not only acceptable, but socially necessary. The way Marcus's wealth and connections had created a protective bubble around his followers that made consequences seem impossible. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Chloe said, looking directly at River for the first time since approaching the podium. "I'm just saying that this school taught us that some students matter more than others, and that lesson made monsters out of kids who should have known better." Drow. The confession prompted chaos in the auditorium as board members huddled in urgent consultation, legal representatives whispered frantically into phones, and media organizations realized they were witnessing live testimony that would reshape the narrative around institutional responsibility for teenage violence. River watched Chloe's breakdown with complicated emotions that mixed satisfaction with genuine pity. The girl who had gleefully documented her humiliation was experiencing her own version of public accountability, and River found herself hoping that Chloe's apparent remorse was genuine rather than another performance designed to minimize legal liability. The board's response to the evening's testimony came in the form of prepared statements that promised comprehensive reforms while avoiding specific admissions of legal responsibility. Principal Morrison was placed on permanent administrative leave pending criminal investigation. 3 teachers, including Mrs. Henley and Mr. Garrett, were terminated immediately for violations of professional ethics and federal civil rights law. New policies were announced requiring mandatory reporting of disability-based harassment, bias training for all faculty and staff, and independent oversight of disciplinary procedures involving disabled students. The changes represented the most significant reform of disciplinary policies in the school's history, but advocates noted that implementation would require ongoing monitoring to ensure compliance rather than cosmetic adjustments. The meeting concluded after midnight, with board members visibly exhausted by hours of testimony that had exposed the full scope of institutional failures, enabling systematic abuse of disabled students. But the real victory belonged to River, whose courage in demanding accountability had created momentum for changes that would protect countless future students from experiencing the harassment and violence she had endured. As camera crews packed their equipment and audiences dispersed into the November darkness, River remained in the auditorium with her parents and Phoenix, absorbing the magnitude of what had been accomplished through months of pain and public advocacy. "You did it," her father said quietly, his pride evident in the way he looked at his daughter, who had transformed personal trauma into systemic change. River's response came after a long pause, her exhaustion evident, but her satisfaction undeniable. "We did it," she corrected, her hand finding Phoenix's head as the service dog settled beside her wheelchair. "And we're not finished yet." The criminal prosecution of Marcus Wellington would continue for months, but the institutional reckoning had already begun. River had proven that even the most privileged predators could be held accountable when their victims refused to be silenced, and that courage could be contagious in ways that transformed individual stories of survival into movements for justice that reached far beyond their origins. The auditorium emptied slowly, but River's impact on the community would endure for generations of students who would benefit from protections that had been purchased with her pain and her refusal to accept that systematic abuse was the price of being different in spaces designed for conformity. Justice had been served, but more importantly, justice had been redefined to include accountability for institutional failures that had enabled individual cruelty to flourish in darkness that could no longer hide the truth about who was protected and who was sacrificed in the name of maintaining order that benefited only those with power to shape the rules that governed everyone else. The federal courthouse in Hartford buzzed with an energy that transcended its usual atmosphere of procedural solemnity. River's case had attracted national media attention that transformed the typically quiet halls of justice into something resembling a political convention, with satellite trucks filling the parking lot and journalists establishing live broadcast positions on the courthouse steps. Marcus Wellington's trial had been moved to federal court after prosecutors successfully argued that his assault on River constituted a hate crime under the Americans with Disabilities Act, elevating potential penalties from juvenile consequences to adult prison sentences that could reshape the trajectory of his privileged existence. River arrived at the courthouse in her new custom wheelchair, its titanium frame and precision engineering representing a significant upgrade from the standard equipment that Marcus had destroyed during his attack. The replacement had been donated by a medical equipment manufacturer whose CEO had been moved by River's story, but it also served as a visible reminder of the permanent consequences of violence that Marcus's legal team was desperately trying to minimize. Phoenix walked beside River's wheelchair with the confident bearing of a service dog whose training had been completed through intensive months of preparation for high-stress environments. The golden retriever's presence attracted attention from spectators who recognized him from viral videos documenting River's rehabilitation, but his focus remained entirely on his handler and the subtle environmental cues that might indicate threats or obstacles. The courtroom itself had been modified to accommodate the extensive media coverage and public interest in the proceedings. Additional seating had been installed, assistive listening devices provided for disabled spectators, and live streaming capabilities established to ensure that audiences around the world could witness justice being served in real time. U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had assembled a prosecution team that included specialists in hate crimes, disability rights, and juvenile violence. Their combined expertise focused on ensuring that Marcus faced consequences commensurate with the systematic nature of his crimes. The federal charges included conspiracy to violate civil rights, assault resulting in bodily injury, and animal cruelty, each carrying potential sentences that could result in years of incarceration. Marcus's defense team, led by one of Connecticut's most expensive criminal attorneys, had crafted a strategy that emphasized his youth, mental health issues, and the allegedly corrupting influence of social media culture on teenage behavior. Their goal was to frame his assault on River as a momentary lapse in judgment rather than the culmination of a sustained campaign of harassment that demonstrated sophisticated planning and calculating cruelty. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney David Kim, painted a starkly different picture of Marcus's actions and motivations. Using enlarged photographs and video evidence projected on courtroom screens, Kim walked the jury through months of harassment that had been carefully documented through social media posts, text messages, and witness testimony. This was not teenage impulsivity, Kim explained to the 12 jurors, whose faces reflected the gravity of the evidence being presented. This was a calculated campaign of terror designed to psychologically destroy a disabled student, culminating in an assault that could have resulted in her death. The evidence presented during the prosecution's case revealed the full scope of Marcus's harassment campaign, including digital forensics that had recovered deleted messages and social media posts, demonstrating premeditation that extended back months before the actual assault. Text conversations between Marcus and his co-conspirators included detailed discussions about how to escalate harassment without triggering immediate consequences from school administrators. Particularly damaging was evidence that Marcus had researched River's disability and service dog training protocols, using that knowledge to develop harassment strategies specifically designed to exploit vulnerabilities created by her reliance on Diesel for mobility assistance and medical alert functions. The defendant didn't just attack River Castellanos, Prosecutor Walsh argued during her presentation of evidence. He studied her, learned her weaknesses, and crafted a campaign of psychological warfare that targeted not just her, but her service animal, knowing that separating them would maximize her vulnerability. River's testimony represented the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case, her clear and detailed account of months of harassment, creating a timeline that demonstrated the systematic nature of Marcus's campaign. Speaking directly to the jury, River described not just the physical assault, but the psychological impact of sustained dehumanization that had preceded the attack. "He didn't just push me down those stairs," River explained, her voice steady despite the difficulty of reliving traumatic memories in a crowded courtroom. "He spent months convincing me that I didn't belong, that I was a burden, that my presence in normal spaces was an inconvenience that other people shouldn't have to tolerate." River's testimony included details about the sophisticated nature of the harassment campaign, including evidence that Marcus had coordinated with other students to ensure that her isolation was complete and that potential allies were discouraged from offering support through subtle social pressure and explicit threats. The prosecution's presentation of video evidence proved particularly compelling to jurors who witnessed Marcus's assault on River and his subsequent attack on Diesel with the telescoping baton that had been concealed in his backpack. Frame-by-frame analysis demonstrated the premeditated nature of the violence, including Marcus's positioning at the top of the stairs and the precise timing of his shove that suggested prior planning rather than spontaneous aggression. Medical testimony from River's treating physicians established the severity of her injuries and the long-term consequences that would affect her mobility and pain management for years to come. Dr. Sarah Chen's presentation included radiographic evidence of spinal compression and wrist fractures that could have been fatal if River had landed differently during her fall down the granite staircase. Veterinary testimony about Diesel's injuries provided additional evidence of Marcus's callous disregard for life, with the service dog's treating veterinarian describing injuries that could have resulted in permanent disability or death if the attack had continued for additional seconds. The defense team's strategy focused on challenging the federal hate crime charges by arguing that Marcus's actions, while reprehensible, were motivated by teenage social dynamics rather than bias against disabled people specifically. Defense attorney Robert Harrison argued that the prosecution was criminalizing adolescent immaturity rather than holding Marcus accountable for a genuine hate crime. Marcus Wellington is guilty of assault, Harrison acknowledged during his opening statement, but he is not guilty of the systematic campaign of disability-based harassment that prosecutors have described. He is a 17-year-old boy who made a terrible decision in a moment of anger, not a calculating predator who targeted River Castellanos because of her disability. The defense presentation included character witnesses who testified about Marcus's volunteer work with disabled children, academic achievements that suggested intelligence and empathy, and expert testimony about adolescent brain development that emphasized the limited capacity for long-term thinking that characterized teenage decision-making. But the prosecution's rebuttal systematically dismantled the defense narrative by presenting evidence that Marcus's volunteer work had been court-ordered community service, resulting from previous incidents of violence, that his academic achievements had been facilitated by grade inflation designed to maintain his wealthy family's continued donations, and that his behavior toward disabled individuals had been consistently predatory throughout his educational career. Most damaging to the defense case was the prosecution's presentation of Marcus's social media history, which revealed a pattern of derogatory comments about disabled people that extended back years before his attack on River. Posts that joked about wheelchair users, mocked service animals, and celebrated violence against disabled individuals demonstrated bias that contradicted defense claims about momentary lapses in judgment. The jury's deliberation lasted 3 days, during which crowds of disability rights advocates maintained vigils outside the courthouse while social media campaigns tracked the proceedings with hashtags that continued trending nationally. The attention had transformed River's case into a referendum on whether wealthy perpetrators would face meaningful consequences for violence against disabled victims. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom fell silent as foreman Patricia Rodriguez stood to deliver the findings that would determine Marcus Wellington's future and establish precedents for disability-based hate crime prosecutions nationwide. On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights, we find the defendant guilty, Rodriguez announced, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. On the charge of assault resulting in bodily injury, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of animal cruelty, we find the defendant guilty. The verdicts prompted emotional reactions throughout the courtroom, with Rivers' supporters celebrating while Marcus's family sat in stunned silence as the reality of his convictions settled over them. Marcus himself remained motionless, his privileged existence suddenly reduced to the prospect of federal incarceration that would separate him from the wealth and connections that had previously insulated him from consequences. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to the discredited school principal, scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, during which time federal probation officers would prepare reports about Marcus's background and the appropriate consequences for his crimes. The judge's preliminary comments suggested that the systematic nature of the harassment campaign and the severity of Rivers' injuries would warrant significant incarceration rather than the probation that Marcus's family had hoped might be possible. Rivers' reaction to the verdicts combined relief with a profound sense of vindication that extended beyond personal justice to encompass broader principles about equality and accountability. The guilty verdicts established legal precedents that would protect future victims of disability-based violence, while demonstrating that privilege could no longer guarantee immunity from consequences. The conviction also triggered a cascade of additional investigations and civil lawsuits that would continue reshaping the institutional landscape that had enabled Marcus's crimes. Westfield Preparatory Academy faced federal civil rights investigations, wrongful termination lawsuits from teachers who had attempted to report harassment, and enrollment declines as parents transferred their children to institutions with better reputations for protecting disabled students. Wellington Construction lost millions in government contracts as public agencies distanced themselves from a company whose heir had been convicted of federal hate crimes. The family's social standing in Connecticut's elite circles evaporated completely. Their previous influence transformed into toxic associations that former allies avoided with the efficiency of experienced political operators. But the most significant impact of Marcus's conviction extended beyond individual consequences to encompass systemic changes that would protect countless future victims from experiencing the harassment and violence that River had endured. Federal agencies used the case as a template for investigating institutional failures at schools across the country, resulting in policy changes that strengthened protections for disabled students and accountability measures for administrators who enabled harassment. Rivers' courage in pursuing justice, despite enormous personal costs, had created ripple effects that reached far beyond her individual case, transforming the legal and social landscape in ways that would benefit disabled students for generations to come. As court officers led Marcus Wellington away in handcuffs, his privileged existence officially transformed into federal prisoner status, River felt a satisfaction that transcended personal vindication. Justice had been served not just for her individual suffering, but for every disabled student who had been failed by institutions designed to protect them. The system had finally proven that accountability was possible, even for the most privileged perpetrators, when victims refused to be silenced and communities demanded that justice extend beyond wealth and social connections to encompass fundamental principles of equality and human dignity. Rivers' journey from victim to victor was complete, but her impact on American society was just beginning to reshape the landscape of justice for generations who would benefit from the precedents established through her courage and persistence in the face of systematic oppression. The years that followed Marcus Wellington's conviction transformed River Castellanos from a local victim into a national advocate whose story continued inspiring disabled students across the country to demand accountability from institutions that had previously operated with impunity. The federal hate crime conviction had established legal precedents that prosecutors nationwide used to pursue similar cases, while the media coverage had created public awareness about disability-based harassment that translated into policy changes at every level of American education. River's academic journey continued at Stanford University, where she studied disability rights law, while maintaining her role as a spokesperson for systemic change in educational institutions. Her presence on campus attracted both admiration and controversy, with some students viewing her as an inspiration, while others resented the attention her advocacy brought to uncomfortable questions about privilege and accountability. Phoenix accompanied River throughout her college experience, his training adaptable to new environments and challenges that came with independence from her family's protective presence. The service dog's calm demeanor and professional competence helped normalize disability accommodation in spaces where River's wheelchair and advocacy work might otherwise have created tension or uncomfortable awareness of accessibility issues. The Marcus Wellington case had established River as a reluctant expert on institutional bias, resulting in speaking engagements at conferences, universities, and policy organizations that sought to understand how systematic harassment could be prevented through proactive intervention rather than reactive punishment. Her presentations combined personal narrative with legal analysis, creating compelling arguments for reform that resonated with audiences ranging from school administrators to federal legislators. Justice isn't just about punishing perpetrators, River would tell audiences, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed personal trauma into systemic change. It's about creating institutional cultures where harassment can't flourish in the first place. River's advocacy work led to the establishment of the Diesel Foundation, named in honor of her original service dog, whose courageous protection had helped expose the violence that privileged students had been perpetrating with institutional protection. The foundation provided legal support for disabled students facing harassment, funded service dog training programs, and lobbied for federal legislation strengthening civil rights protections in educational settings. Marcus Wellington served 18 months in federal prison, a sentence that his expensive legal team had managed to minimize through cooperation with investigators pursuing cases against other students who had participated in harassment campaigns at schools across Connecticut. His incarceration transformed him from privileged predator into cautionary tale, though whether his apparent remorse reflected genuine understanding or strategic positioning remained a subject of debate among those who had witnessed his systematic cruelty. Upon his release, Marcus faced a social landscape that had been permanently altered by his conviction and the movement that River's courage had inspired. Wellington Construction never recovered from the reputational damage associated with their heir's hate crime conviction, eventually filing bankruptcy and dissolving assets that had once made the family pillars of Connecticut's business community. Marcus's attempt to rebuild his life included court-mandated community service with disability organizations, public statements accepting responsibility for his crimes, and therapy sessions designed to address the entitlement and bias that had motivated his harassment campaign. But his efforts at redemption were complicated by the permanent nature of digital evidence that ensured his crimes would remain searchable and accessible to anyone investigating his background. The transformation of Westfield Preparatory Academy represented perhaps the most visible symbol of institutional accountability that River's case had achieved. New leadership implemented comprehensive bias training, established independent oversight of disciplinary procedures, and created support systems for disabled students that served as models for schools across the country. Principal Morrison's replacement, Dr. Angela Chen, brought experience from disability advocacy organizations and a commitment to creating inclusive environments that protected all students equally. Under her leadership, the school's culture shifted from one that had enabled systematic harassment to one that celebrated diversity and held students accountable for behavior that created hostile environments for their peers. River Castellanos saved this school from itself, Dr. Chen often said when discussing the reforms that had followed the Wellington conviction, her courage in demanding accountability forced us to confront institutional failures that we had been ignoring for years. The broader impact of River's case extended into federal policy through legislation that strengthened hate crime protections for disabled individuals and increased funding for civil rights enforcement in educational settings. The River Castellanos Civil Rights Act, signed into law 3 years after Marcus's conviction, required schools receiving federal funding to implement comprehensive anti-harassment policies and provided resources for disabled students pursuing legal remedies against institutional discrimination. But perhaps the most profound impact of River's advocacy was the cultural shift that her story had helped inspire among disabled students who had previously accepted harassment as an inevitable aspect of their educational experience. Social media campaigns using hashtags like #GreaterThanNoMoreSilence and #GreaterThanDisabilityJustice connected victims across the country, creating support networks that helped isolated students understand that systematic harassment was neither normal nor legally permissible. River's own healing process continued through therapy sessions that helped her process the trauma of sustained harassment while maintaining her advocacy commitments that had grown far beyond her original quest for personal justice. The intersection of victim and activist created psychological challenges that required ongoing professional support. But River's sense of purpose in preventing other students from experiencing her suffering provided motivation that sustained her through difficult periods. Phoenix's role in River's life evolved as her independence increased, though the bond between them remained central to her daily functioning and emotional stability. The service dog's training continued expanding to accommodate new environments and responsibilities, his presence a constant reminder of the partnership between human and animal that had helped expose the cruelty of privileged predators who had assumed their victims would remain silent. The legal precedents established through Marcus Wellington's prosecution continued generating additional cases, as prosecutors nationwide recognized that disability-based harassment could be successfully prosecuted under federal hate crime statutes. River's willingness to testify in support of other victims created a network of accountability that helped ensure justice for students who might otherwise have been failed by local institutions more interested in protecting perpetrators than their victims. The transformation from victim to advocate had required sacrifices that included privacy, normalcy, and the simple ability to attend school without becoming a symbol of broader social justice movements. But River's impact on American society represented a legacy that would protect countless future students from experiencing the systematic harassment that had nearly destroyed her spirit before ultimately revealing the strength that she had inherited from her military father and immigrant mother. "I never wanted to be famous," River reflected during a speech at her Stanford graduation ceremony, her voice carrying to audiences watching via live stream across the country. "But I'm grateful that my suffering could be transformed into something that prevents other people from experiencing what I endured." River's story had proven that even the most privileged perpetrators could be held accountable when their victims refused to be silenced, that institutions could be forced to change when public pressure made maintaining the status quo politically impossible, and that individual courage could create ripple effects that reached far beyond personal circumstances to reshape the landscape of justice for entire communities. The little girl who had been thrown down a staircase by a bully had become a woman whose voice carried the authority of someone who had transformed personal trauma into systemic change, proving that justice was possible even when it required challenging the most powerful members of society and the institutions that protected them. River Castellanos had won more than a legal victory. She had demonstrated that accountability was achievable, that privilege was not immunity, and that the courage to demand justice could transform individual suffering into collective progress that benefited everyone who believed in equality, dignity, and the fundamental principle that no student should have to endure harassment simply for being different in a world that too often punished difference, rather than celebrating the diversity that made communities stronger. Her legacy would endure in the legal precedents she had established, the institutional changes she had inspired, and the countless students who would benefit from protections that had been purchased with her pain and her refusal to accept that systematic abuse was the inevitable price of being disabled in spaces designed for conformity rather than inclusion. Justice had been served, but more importantly, justice had been redefined to encompass accountability for institutional failures that enabled individual cruelty, creating a new standard for how society would protect its most vulnerable members from those who would exploit their disability for entertainment, harassment, or violence. River's journey from victim to victor was complete, but her impact on American society would continue inspiring future generations of advocates who understood that courage could be contagious and that justice was possible when victims refused to be silenced by those who preferred darkness to the light that exposed truth about power, privilege, and the fundamental equality that democracy required to function for everyone, rather than just those with wealth and connections to protect them from consequences. The revolution had begun in a high school hallway and culminated in a federal courtroom, but its effects would ripple through American society for decades to come, protecting countless students from experiencing the systematic harassment that had nearly destroyed one brave young woman who had chosen to fight back rather than accept that cruelty was the price of being different in a world that demanded conformity rather than celebrating the diversity that made communities stronger and more just for everyone.